In this video, we will identify different components of the smartphone. Here we have a Samsung Galaxy S3 phone, and we'll start with the antenna first. The signal is received by the antenna here. This is the main antenna. A typical smartphone will have several antennas. One is called the main antenna for the communications. We also have a different antenna for Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, also GPS, and most smartphones these days have near-field communications, which is called NFC. So there's typically about 5 or so antennas per smartphone. And the most important antenna is this antenna, which is called the main antenna. You can see that this has quite a long trace here, and there's also a gap inside the metal. And also this metal, this conductive trace, is underneath this white plastic. And it's underneath so that the antenna won't be damaged when the cover is taken off, when the back cover is taken off, and some modifications or repairs could be made to the antenna, and we don't want this main antenna to be touched at all, to be modified at all. And one important part about this is this portion here. This is the feed of the antenna. So the signal comes in and out of this signal. An incoming signal from a cell phone tower will be picked up by this main antenna, and the signal will be traced through here and go through this feed and underneath this cover and into the main motherboard over here where the signal is processed. And then you can hear the other person's voice, or you can see a video conference, or text messages are sent back and forth. That is done through this main antenna. Unless, of course, the text is sent through Wi-Fi, which will be a different antenna. Okay. A rule of thumb for antennas is that the longer the trace, the lower the frequency that the antenna will operate at. For 4G LTE phones, typically there are two frequency bands. One is the lower frequency, which operates at 700 megahertz, 800 megahertz, 900 megahertz, and in that range. And also an upper frequency, which operates at 1.8 gigahertz and 1.9 gigahertz. Depending on the different countries, these frequency bands may change a little bit. For example, in Europe it's also different, Asia, South America, US, and depending on the different countries. Let's look at the second antenna here, which is actually shorter. So if we go back to the rule of thumb that I mentioned before, the shorter the antenna, the higher the frequency that this antenna will operate at. Meaning, if this was 700, 800, or 900 megahertz, this will probably be around 2.4 gigahertz, or maybe even 5 gigahertz. Wi-Fi antennas operate at those frequencies. Bluetooth is also at high frequencies as well. So we can imagine that this would be one of those antennas. And also it has a feed here where the signal is picked up by this metal and goes through this metal and into this feed and goes underneath the feed and into this board. So let's look at where the feed is located underneath this cover. Okay, so if we take off this cover, okay, place that here. Right, so here we see the feed, right? And this feed is connected to this piece here. Okay, so let's take a look at this a little bit closer. Okay. So you can see this metal piece is connected here, and the signal will go through this path. And this feed here is connected to a motherboard, which is actually missing for this particular phone, and so the signal will go through this metal and through the different trace and onto this motherboard here. Let's focus on where the signal comes from, this feed, and where the signal goes to. So if we zoom in a little bit closer, you can see here, this is where the motherboard touches the antenna. And the signal will go through this component. This can be either a capacitor, inductor, or a resistor. And we can see many of those components here. So all of these rectangular box-shaped components are either a resistor, a capacitor or an inductor. And typically the larger ones are capacitors. In the next video, we will look at the integrated circuits, transistors, and other components in this motherboard and in the smartphone.